Welcome to Season 3 of the Do No Harm podcast, where we discuss the battle to keep politics out of medicine. Hosted by Ian Kingsbury, Do No Harm's Director of Research, and Scott Centorino, Vice President of Policy and Programs.
Welcome back to the Do No Harm podcast, where we defend the core values of medical practice every week. Hosted by myself, Ian Kingsbury, Do No Harm's Director of Research, and Scott Centorino, VP of Policy and Programs. Tune in as we tackle issues such as how to combat DEI in medicine and med schools and so-called gender-affirming care, all to protect patients and ensure healthcare focuses on science and solutions, not politics. Good to be with you again, Scott.
Same here, Ian. We're off to the races.
That's right. And on that note, I think everyone right now is rightfully focused on the election and, maybe a little bit with some events in the Middle East. Our issue areas here.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about, Ian.
A new mascot for a cereal brand or something. I don't know. I heard people are talking about this.
Yeah.
So our issues are perhaps a little bit less salient right now, but there was some big news recently that there was a letter from, I believe it was 21 state AGs with consumer protection complaints against the American Academy of Pediatrics for their claim that puberty blockers are safe and fully reversible. So it seems like kind of a big deal.
I think so, Ian. And I was just talking to a former AG, and he was saying how surprised he was that more AGs weren't jumping on this. And so this is a great development to see that this topic is where it belongs, which is at least in AG's offices in the realm of consumer protection. Is what consumers are worth protecting more, need more protection from other agencies and other institutions than kids with dangerous, unproven medical care.
Yeah. It's a little surprising to me that it took this long, truthfully, when you look at what the AAP says about this. I mean, it seems crazy, just totally detached from reality. But I guess better late than never.
Yeah, and I've worked in a AG's office before. The main problem they have is just bandwidth. I mean, you could say that about any government institution, but the delta between what AGs are thought of as having the power to do and what they actually have the resources to do is pretty big and bigger than most agencies. A lot of turnover among younger lawyers. These offices are not as big as you'd think. And so I think we should be pretty happy that it's happened at this point.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. I am. I'm happy. We're here. It's time.
Good.
So hopefully,
you don't look happy,
this...
and let's get a little bit more of a smile out of you, man.
No, I mean, this is important on really turning up the heat on the AAP. It's malfeasance that they've done this, and it's time. So excited to see where this goes, even if it's not quite as quick as I would have wanted it. Anyway, we're gonna have a lot to talk about with our guests, so let's get into it. Dr. Jay Greene is a senior research fellow in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation and a senior fellow at Do No Harm. Jay is the former head of the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas, where I had the good fortune to earn my PhD under his tutelage. His research has covered diverse topics, and in recent years has included work on both pediatric gender medicine and DEI. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Jay.
Thanks for having me on.
So just to get right into it, there's a lot of people now talking about the nexus between DEI and anti-Semitism. And I think for a lot of people, they awoke to this reality in the weeks and months that followed October 7th, seeing that these DEI officials were silent or sometimes even antagonistic towards Jewish students and Jewish faculty. But you caught on to this problem earlier. You had a report back in 2021 exposing this problem. So I think it would be helpful for our listeners to hear what did that report observe and what tuned you into this problem in the first place?
Sure. I hate being right. Such a burden being right. But yes, I did a study with James Paul, who was also a doctoral student at the University of Arkansas. in 2021 on this, where we analyzed the social media feeds of DEI staff at 65 universities. And that was based on, it was a follow-up on an earlier study we had done where we had simply counted how many DEI staff universities had. And in that process, we recorded their names and their titles, so we knew who they were. So we followed up to see what they were saying on social media. And in particular, we were interested in what they had to say about Israel and what they had to say, for comparison's sake, about China. And remember, this was in the midst of the pandemic, and so there was a lot that one might have to say about China. But what we found is, first, they were obsessed with Israel relative to China. So DEI staff were tweeting about Israel more than 3 times as much about Israel as China, even though Israel's a little country and China's big and there was a pandemic going on. So there was an obsession that we could see. In addition, their comments about either their tweets or retweets or likes were 96% critical of the Jewish state, while about China, they were 62% favorable. So they are obsessed with Israel and almost monolithically criticizing Israel, but China they like. So if it were simply a matter of DEI staff having a concern about human rights, a particular sensitivity about that, you might expect they would be critical of China as well, but they were not. And so we were trying to ring the alarm bell that DEI was actually promoting anti-Semitism on campus, and that it was intrinsic to the founding ideology of these DEI bureaucracies, that it actually flowed naturally from their founding principles. And we tried to. So, so how did I pick up on even to look for this? There were a few things. One was that I'd been working at a university for a long time, and I had seen this coming in academia. So I could see both the rise of DEI and the rise of anti-Semitism in the academy. And I could see how they were connected. Now, many people in academia didn't see that, so maybe I was just tuned into it better. But having been in academia helped me recognize this danger earlier. The second thing was actually a study that you and I did with Albert Cheng, another colleague, where we looked at the relationship between educational attainment and anti-Semitism. So the common belief about anti-Semitism is that it's a function of ignorance, and the solution is education. So the reason why people hate Jews, the theory goes, is that people don't know about Jews, don't understand that anti-Semitism is bad, and that if we only teach them about Jews and teach them that anti-Semitism is bad, then they won't hate Jews. And then it flows from this theory that the problem of anti-Semitism is concentrated among low education people, not high education people. I had the suspicion that this was exactly opposite, that actually highly educated people were more likely to be anti-Semitic and low education people were less likely. And this, again, was informed a little bit by being in academia, so I could see it. But also it was informed by living in Arkansas at the time, where my low education neighbors were wonderfully follow-Semitic. And they were the ones that the New York Times was wringing their hands about as the Jew haters, but they were not. It was in the academy where I found the Jew hatred, not at the farmer's market. And so and then if one actually thinks even a little bit historically about anti-Semitism, the Nazis were, drawing from very highly educated populations. Germany was one of the most advanced, progressive thinking countries on the planet at the time, and yet they were thoroughly seduced into Jew hatred without any difficulty. Came very naturally to them. And so this whole theory about the relationship between anti-Semitism and ignorance seemed to me wrong. And in fact, what we found was that people with higher educational hated Jews more, treated Jews more roughly. And the only way we were able to detect it is by changing how we measured anti-Semitism. So the problem with past measures of anti-Semitism is they basically just asked people, what do you think about Jews? And highly educated people are sophisticated, so they know what they're being asked and they know what the socially acceptable answer is, so they don't reveal what they think. They hide it better. And the reason why lower educated people look like they're more anti-Semitic is because they're not that sophisticated and they just answer and reveal a little bit more than highly educated people do. We got around that by measuring anti-Semitism in a way where people didn't know it was being measured. What we did is we created scenarios where there were two versions, and people were randomly assigned to either see a version with a Jewish case or a non-Jewish case, but they were basically the same scenario. So things like, do you think the military should be able to restrict the wearing of kippot or yarmulkes, or restrict the wearing of turbans by Sikhs, right? And we did this kind of double standard scenario building a number of times, and we showed again people randomly one version or the other, so no one knows they're being compared, but we could compare whole groups. And what we found was that highly educated people were much more willing to stick it to Jews relative to non-Jews, when substantively they should have treated them the same. While lower educated people were actually philo-Semitic. They actually were more inclined to treat the Jews better. So that fed into looking at the DEI staff, and I did think that DEI ideology was part of driving this, because there's basically a watered down Marxism that that flows into critical theory, then flows into DEI ideology. They're all connected, and the basic principle is that is a departure from traditional American values about equal treatment of everyone under the law, but instead thinks that there are really two categories of people who are deserving of different treatment based on their status. So people are either classified as oppressors or oppressed. Oppressors are deserving of having their privileges taken away, and the oppressed are deserving of restitution for historic and collective wrongs. And this, feels a lot like, capitalist workers in a Marxist scheme, and it functions basically the same way, except that we've changed the categories based on ethnic, racial, and sexual identities instead of economic identities. And so the problem for Jews in this scheme, either the Marxist scheme or the watered down DEI scheme, is that Jews are inevitably classified as oppressors. And the reason for that is that despite the oppression that Jews have experienced and the difficulties they've endured, they have thrived. On average, Jews tend to succeed in developed countries. And so the way that the DEI theory figures out who's an oppressor or an oppressed is based on whether they succeed or fail at disproportionate rates. So if Jews are successful at higher rates than their percentage of the population, it must be that they did something dastardly to have that success. They must have stolen it from someone else. So that's the ideology behind DEI. I could see it in universities, and sure enough, when we go out and look at their social media feeds, they were saying it. And by the way, them saying it is a little bit like doctors. If you went and looked up doctors on social media feeds, and they were all saying smoking and doing crack is awesome, like there would be a betrayal of their professional obligations. So you would think that DEI staff would have some sort of professional obligation to be advocating for equal treatment and inclusion, but they don't. They do the opposite. So they have their professional norms are not what you imagine they are. Their professional norms, as they see it, are to advance this watered-down Marxist view of the world.
Sorry, yeah. I feel a little bit between you two, who not only know far more about this than me, but also go back personally with each other. I feel a little bit like the neighbor who kind of bumbles and wanders into your backyard barbecue. Not quite welcome, but you kind of let him have a burger or a hot dog.
Come get a burger. No, we want you
Everyone's
here.
welcome. Everyone's welcome.
So the clarifying question is connecting the dots between this seeming contradiction between DEI being all about looking out for oppressed groups, and we all understand the history of anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jews in this country. That contradiction, how the DEI ideology overcomes that. The question that I have is, there are other groups that are racial minorities or religious minorities that are disproportionately successful in this country. I think of Asian Americans being an obvious one. They tend to be more successful and they're a racial minority. You certainly see some oppressor-oppressed confusion when it comes to them. There are other groups like Nigerian Americans, who I think last time I checked are actually the most educated group of Americans in the country, and obviously they're a racial minority. Is it just, in the case of Jewish Americans, is the anti-Semitism in DEI, do you think, just because of the success of Jews in America, or is it, how much of it is tied to the behavior of Israel? And you think that there's some nexus there that is pushing aside the success of Jews in America, but it's really a foreign policy question?
So first, I think these other groups do get hate from DEI bureaucracies. Asians have been the recipients of animosity from DEI ideology, and it's Asians who were the victims in the lawsuit that ultimately led the Supreme Court to end racial preferences in university admissions. So I don't think Jews are unique in being the recipients of hatred from the DEI ideology. But as to your question about whether Israel exacerbates maybe this animosity towards Jews in the United States, I think the way to think about Israel is that it's like the Jew of the nations. So by all rights, it shouldn't be thriving. It's tiny. It doesn't have a lot of resources. It's surrounded by enemies. It has been for its entire existence. And yet it's doing great. It's prosperous. It's growing in population. It has the highest birth rate of any industrialized country. How is that? How do they manage to do that? And just as this DEI ideology leads people to think, well, Jews, they're so successful, they must have done something dastardly to be successful. So too, people look at Israel and they say, well, by all rights, it shouldn't be successful. They must be doing something dastardly. They must be sneaky. They must be tricking other countries into doing things for them, deceiving or hijacking the foreign policy of the United States and other great powers. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive. They wouldn't exist if it weren't for that sneaky, dastardly behavior of the Israelis. And the reason, the thing that connects both of these and kind of the essence of anti-Semitism is the double standard. So Natan Sharansky, identified this as a key element of anti-Semitism is do you treat Jews differently than you would treat non-Jews in the same scenario? And that's what led us to do these double standard scenarios for our study on educational attainment and anti-Semitism. But it also speaks to anti-Zionism, is a double standard. So other people can have a nation state, but not Jews. Other states can have official religions, but not Jews. Other states can defend themselves against attacks, but not Jews. Right. So Israel is a victim of the same kind of double standard that makes it the Jew of nations that Jews experience individually.
If you're listening to the Do No Harm podcast, odds are you're concerned about the steady creep of DEI and identity politics in medical institutions nationwide. The best way to fight back is by becoming a free member of Do No Harm. We have more than 11,000 members nationwide, from physicians to nurses to folks in academia and concerned parents. Membership is free. Join us at donoharmmedicine.org/become a member. Okay, so I hear you that DEI targets other other successful minority groups. I definitely agree with that. I see it certainly on an institutional level, right? When we look at something like affirmative action and the toll that it takes on these highly qualified Asian applicants. But it looks to me that beyond that, there's a special venom that's held for Jews in particular within this ideology. I guess, first of all, do you see that? And if you do you have any theories on why that is?
Sure. So I think part of it is an enduring success of Jews. So Jews aren't just successful at the moment and in this current place, but have been, by all rights, you could look at Jews as a people and say, how do they exist? Like, why are they still here? Other peoples that became stateless disappeared. How did this people not only survive but prosper? So I think that has given a longer history of this kind of exceptional success that has drawn negative attention. But I think a lot of it also is in what institutions, what occupations Jews are particularly successful. So Jews have thrived particularly in academia and medicine. And that's where we're seeing the most anti-Semitism. And a lot of this is driven by basically envy and the coveting of positions that Jews hold, right? So an attraction of the DEI ideology to a lot of people in academia and in medicine is not because they're Marxists. They haven't imbibed fully some sort of Marxist worldview, but there's stuff they want, and they see Jews having it, and they want it. And so the DEI ideology helps them displace the Jews and grab those spots. So that it's just petty jealousy that drives a fair amount of this in both academia and medicine. There was a time there where the Ivy League was, a majority of the Ivy League presidents were Jews, not very long ago. Okay. And, and then, people like Claudine Gay, who I went to grad school with, she's not a Marxist. She's not. Okay. She's not a radical. She just was very ambitious. And she looked at, Lawrence Summers and she said, why does he have that job? Why don't I have it? I want it. Right. And as it turns out, DEI is a fantastic club to beat other people over the head and take their spots. And that's basically what has happened in academia and in medicine. There were a lot of Jewish doctors, and so part of what happens with DEI is people say, well, why do the Jews have those spots? I want it. And so that's how you get UCLA going from, more than a third Jewish students in their medical school to 1 or 2 currently. I mean, it's astounding in a period of 10, 20 years that you could basically make UCLA Medical School Judenrein. And it is. And that's, and it's, it's quite naked, actually. It's really just resource jealousy. I want your spots. I want your stuff. I have an ideology that justifies my grabbing it from you and feeling righteous about it. I don't feel like I'm doing a bad thing. I think I'm promoting equity by taking stuff from the Jew. And so you feel really great about it. And so people like, to feel righteous when they also benefit themselves.
I think we're already pulling on this thread, right? But just to flesh it out a little bit more, it's striking to me, a lot of conservative, or maybe what we would think of as classically liberal commentariat, I think was annoyed and disturbed by claims of systemic racism, both within the United States generally and within certain institutions specifically, including within healthcare. Is skeptical of these claims, believing they're overwrought. And now a lot of us, and that includes Do No Harm, are talking about our concerns with anti-Semitism. And so how do you square that circle? Why did we, how is it that we went from saying that there's too much discussion about discrimination generally to now wanting to have a conversation about bigotry?
So first, I don't think it depends on what we mean by the word systemic. So I think when people use the word systemic, they mean that it is unable to be removed. That it isn't simply a wrong choice that could be reversed, but it is something that is so deeply ingrained and unconscious that it cannot be eliminated and therefore needs to be corrected through conscious and repeated efforts forever. It never ends. There is no end to it because the system is always biased and therefore there always needs to be a correction. And so that I think that is a mistaken worldview, that hatreds are ingrained in a system and can't be reversed and must be corrected forever. I don't agree with that, and I don't think it's the case with respect to Jews. Even though Jews, have been the victim of discrimination a lot across history, frankly, so has every group. Every group has received hate from some other group at some point and in some way. And so the way we end these hatreds and the way we overcome these hatreds is by prioritizing a standard of equality. That is, to treat all the same without respect to their identity, simply based on their merit and what they have to offer, not who they are and their background. And Jews can thrive in such a system. Jews do just fine without any special treatment or any special protection. They don't need and would not benefit from a DEI bureaucracy that added Jews to the list of protected identities. That would be bad. So I don't think that's what I'm advocating. I don't think that's what Do No Harm is advocating. I think what we're pushing for here is a removal of discrimination and bigotry in these institutions by prioritizing equal treatment of all and an emphasis on merit and not identity.
Well said. And, I think beyond that, you and I have spoken about this a little bit offline, but there's this question of evidentiary standard when it comes to identifying this bad behavior, right? So for me, at least, when it comes to this claim of, especially usually when we're talking about anti-Black racism, it's usually justified by a claim of group differences and outcomes. But, I think we need to depart with that notion and return to this idea that we identify bigotry through acts of bigotry. So when people are out there chanting "globalize the Intifada," that's a problem. Similarly, if there were people out there with a noose threatening Black people, that we would be there, shoulder to shoulder protesting against it. So, am I right?
I think that's right, and part of DEI ideology, part of how they identify who's an oppressor and who's an oppressed, is based on their relative success. So, as Ibram Kendi argued, any disproportionate negative outcome is evidence of oppression at some point in history, is his argument. Okay, so if Blacks are underrepresented in some desirable thing, then that must be the result of some oppression at some point, which requires restitution. But it also follows logically from that same argument that any overrepresentation then has to be evidence of having been an oppressor, at least at some point in history, even if not you individually. You are the beneficiary of oppression, even if not the perpetrator of it. And so that's the worldview that I entirely reject, is the idea that we can classify people as oppressors and oppressed, and that we can figure out who they are based on their relative success or failure in any particular. And by the way, it's always selected domains, right? It's not as if it's in every domain that we invoke this argument. on equality among men and women, we tend not to see people say, why are there not more women working in coal mines? This doesn't come up. And no one gets very upset that, Jews are not as represented in, professional sports. We always like to find, the Jews.
It's never going to change.
Right,
Sorry.
right. Well, we have our little, Sandy Koufax moments, but that's okay. It doesn't, I think, mean that we're the victims of some sort of systemic anti-Semitism on the part of professional sports. It's just that people, for various reasons, both culturally and path dependent, make different choices in their lives, and what we want is a system where everyone can have the chance to thrive in all these different domains if they wish. And so, if there are women who really aspire to be coal miners, I think it's really important that they have that opportunity. And if there are Jews who are, big and strong and want to be football players, I think they should have that opportunity. But I don't think the absence of women from coal mines and the absence of Jews from professional football is evidence of discrimination.
Well said. Scott, you must have
questions. Can I ask one last question? Yeah, one last one for me. One of the interesting pieces of this, sorry, this is me grabbing another hot dog at the table at the backyard barbecue. One of the interesting pieces of this for me is, politically speaking, I haven't seen any numbers all that recently, but I think I'm pretty safe in saying that the majority of American Jews are still of the left politically. That maybe that's been changing over time. I think it has been changing over time, but I think we're still talking about a majority are on the left politically. How does that impact this? I mean, it's also probably fair to say that a majority of Black voters are on the left, but they may not go along with, a majority of them may not go along with some of the basic DEI principles that a lot of DEI advocates say that are representative of the entire Black population. There are schisms here that are important, and minority views being represented as majority views of minority groups, which is frustrating endlessly. But my question is, does it make a difference in this debate that Jews are by and large political allies of the groups that are at least home to DEI ideology? Would it be worse, in other words, if there weren't some kind of political alliance there, or hope of a political alliance? Or does it really make no difference that the advocates are so married to these beliefs that they're not really interested in coalition building, even for practical purposes?
So I actually think the fact that Jews have been predominantly on the left politically has actually made Jews more vulnerable to this line of attack, because it's harder for us to recognize it coming. And in fact, we have helped facilitate strengthening it, not understanding where it would lead. So, Jews are sympathetic, have preferences for redistribution. And so the argument that, well, there ought to be more spots for people who've been underrepresented sounds great, not seeing where that might lead with respect to their self-interest. And so I think the predominant leftism of Jews have actually caused a weakened immune system that have made them catch a much worse case of DEI than otherwise would be the case. The hope that Jews would be able to enter into the intersectional coalition and moderate the Jew hatred by being a participant in that, I think doesn't understand the fundamental motivation of this movement, which is to take people's stuff and their spots. So, it's very hard to, that's a zero-sum game. You're the dean of medicine at a school. I would like to be the dean of medicine at that school. This is zero sum, and you can't enter into a coalition to compromise on this very easily. And so, but what you have had is Jews have been able to spare themselves, maybe, but then it negatively affects younger Jews entering. So maybe Jewish doctors have been able to spare their spots, but their children and grandchildren trying to get into med school are discovering that that's not so easy anymore. or trying to get that attractive residency. That's not so easy anymore. Or trying to get hired into the attractive academic medicine position is also not so easy. So there's some intergenerational trade-offs that are occurring among Jews as a result of Jews not seeing this danger as clearly as they could. Now, look, Jews come by their leftism honestly. There are lots of philosophical and religious reasons for it, but there are also kind of just diaspora survival reasons. So it's kind of smart for Jews to argue about, not treating minorities poorly as a great way of saying, don't treat me poorly. So it's a good survival tactic until it isn't. And so the nature of Jewish survival is you have to adapt. And sometimes you have to flee. We're good at fleeing, actually. So there may be areas in academia where, fighting to recapture it is a bad idea. I mean, the smart thing for Jews to do is just flee it, denounce it, and hope that it destroys itself, or that, with your help. And in medicine, though, I don't think it's that far gone. I think that it's a fight that Jews can still have. And look, there are other reasons why Jews may decline in their prevalence in medicine, independent of anti-Semitism. First, objectively, Jews may be less meritorious and other groups may be rising in merit. And that would be a perfectly fine outcome if that were the case. And I think it is, at least partially. And also, Jews, have found other opportunities. Medicine is a great opportunity when you're a rising, relatively new immigrant group, because it's a way to become very successful without having to work for a large corporation for others and get and have networking. You could do it yourself, and immigrant groups are always attracted to medicine as an upward social class vehicle. But Jews have already made it, and so now maybe finance looks better, and you see maybe younger, smart Jews gravitating towards Silicon Valley and venture capital more. Instead of medicine. And if that's the case, fine. Again, people are going to make people should make free choices, and people should receive based on their merit, not their identity. And so I don't think we should necessarily think that Jews need to be restored to the same percentage that they once were in medicine. That would be just as wrong as trying to manage any other outcome as evidence of discrimination. But I think that we have direct evidence, as Ian was referencing earlier, of people saying things that are explicitly anti-Semitic. And those are the things that we should do something about. Now, I don't want to forbid people's free speech to say these things. I don't want to have them fired from their academic positions if they hold these views. But I want to shine a light on them so that everyone can see them and natural consequences can follow. So, if you're the doctor and you go around and say, and you tear down hostage posters and you're caught doing that, well, I think that all your clients, all of your patients should be aware of who you are and can make choices. But people are free to hold obnoxious views. But other people are free to react to those obnoxious views and have natural consequences follow.
I would be happy to keep this conversation going for hours.
It's like we're back in school. It's fun. It's great being able to chat with you guys. It's a topic that I think is really important, and that I think Do No Harm is doing really great work on. It's funny. Do No Harm is kind of clearly focused on gender issues with minors and with DEI in medicine, discrimination in medicine, but there's, I think, a special place at Do No Harm for concern about anti-Semitism, because I think it fits within the worldview that Do No Harm is otherwise trying to promote.
I think that's right. I'll have to call you later. We'll pick up this conversation. Maybe we'll record it and it'll be a special feature for our members or something. Anyway,
fun.
Jay, wonderful to have you. Thanks so much for coming on. Terrific conversation.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
This is the Do No Harm podcast. I'm Ian Kingsbury with Scott Centorino. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to receive alerts when new episodes drop. And if you like what you heard, share with your networks. Thanks for standing with us as we restore sanity to medicine.